I'm Ali Reza Fakiravari, and this is an overview of US influenza activity week 45, 2022. So influenza season started in early October in the US. So week 39, which was reported on October 7th, it takes about 5 to 7 days for the data to be published. So typically the data represent 5 to 7 days before these days. So the week 39, there were about 40,000 specimens, and we had 2.5% of these respiratory specimens testing positive for influenza. About 95% of these were influenza A and 5% influenza B. And the large majority of influenza A was H3N2 with about a quarter H1N1. Now, the mortality rates that are reported by the CDC, they are essentially due to pneumonia, influenza, and or COVID-19. Now, the numbers started to increase throughout October. So by week 42, there were about more than 60,000 specimens. Positivity rate continued to increase up to 6.2%. And we can see that large majority influenza A, with H3N2 making 3/4 of these strains. Now, moving on to November, the numbers, of course, continue to increase up until week 45, which there are over 100,000 specimens. Positivity rate continues to increase, so we are at 14.7% now. And the large majority is influenza A, so almost exclusively influenza A, with 75% H3N2. Now, 100% of H3N2 seems to be the 2A.2. Now, these are only a small portion of the specimens that get sequenced, but the isolates that were sequenced, 100% of them were 2A.2. With H1N1, the large majority, 93%, were 5A.2, with a small portion 5A.2. And I mentioned these make a difference when we consider what's in the influenza vaccine. Now, again, flu activity started to pick up in early October, so around week 39, and continues to pretty much exponentially increase. And although from last week to this week seems to be stable, it's hard to tell if this is going to continue steady or continue to go up. We'll find out next week. Now, fortunately, here's what's in the flu vaccine this year. So for 2022-23 influenza season, we have only quadrivalent vaccines. So there are 2 influenza A strains in the vaccine, and we have 2 influenza B strains in the vaccine. One thing that we have changed from last year is essentially the H3N2, because there was a mismatch between vaccine and what was circulating last year. So this was updated. So last year, the H3N2 included the 2A.1, and what ended up circulating last year was 2A.2. So that got updated this year. And as I showed you previously, 100% of what's been sequenced so far seems to be 2A.2. So that's good news. With influenza A, the large majority of sequenced influenza A H1N1 seems to be 5A.2. With just a small portion being 5A.1. So that also seems to be good news as far as matching the circulating influenza viruses. Now, influenza B so far seems to be a very, very small portion of circulating viruses. Now, it makes a difference when there is a mismatch between vaccine and what's circulating. So here's what happened last year. So 2A.2 was circulating, but what was in the vaccine last year was the 2A.1. And this study that was recently published looked at adults age 18 years of age or older who were hospitalized with acute respiratory illness. And essentially, they looked at 295 influenza cases, 47% of which were vaccinated, and over 1,000 influenza and SARS-CoV-2 negative controls, 53% of which were vaccinated, and of course 864 for influenza negative but SARS-CoV-2 positive controls, 49% vaccinated against influenza. And what they found was that influenza vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization was actually extremely low, 11%, and it did not reach statistical significance because 95% confidence interval went from a vaccine effectiveness of negative 19% to a positive 33%. So it crossed zero and it lost statistical significance. Now this was the overall results. Now when we look at some subgroups, so for example, only adults aged 65 years or older, again, no benefit as far as vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization. For age 18 to 64, again, no statistical significance. When we looked at age 18 to 64 with immunocompromising conditions, again, no statistical significance. However, when we look at younger adults, so 18 to 64 without immunocompromising condition, the vaccine seemed to work. So those with an intact immune system, meaning that their body was able to mount an appropriate response to the vaccine, even though there was a mismatch between the virus and the vaccine, there was still a 50% vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization. Now, these data are looking specifically at H3 and 2. This is not considering other strains of influenza A. Now, when they considered SARS-CoV-2 positive, the vaccine effectiveness was actually decreased, and a lower proportion of vaccinated compared with unvaccinated case patients required ICU admission. So that's also a good thing. So even if people did end up in the hospital because of lack of effectiveness, there was still effectiveness against admission to the ICU. So that is also good. Now, given that this year there is a good match between what's in the vaccine and what's circulating, it is important to emphasize the recommendation for vaccination this year. So anybody, all persons aged 6 months and older who do not have contraindication should receive the annual influenza vaccine. There is no preferential recommendation, so any product that's available, it's good to go, except for adults aged 65 years or older. So this is the new recommendation this year, and I will talk about 3 specific formulations that are recommended as preferred for elderly. Now, it takes about 2 weeks on average for the body to mount a response to the vaccine, so that's something to keep in mind. So vaccination should be offered during September and October and continued through flu season while unexpired vaccine supplies last. So, it's not too late to get the flu vaccine while the flu season is ongoing. People should still continue to get their vaccine if they haven't received it yet. And COVID-19 vaccines can be co-administered with influenza vaccine in case, people have concerns that they are getting their COVID vaccine and influenza at the same time. Now, these are the formulations that are available on the market this season. So we have FluMist, which is a live attenuated influenza vaccine. Now, this one is only approved for age 2 years through 49, and even in that age range, it's it's really not preferred. It's preferred to have the inactivated influenza vaccine. Now, these are all egg-based with the exception of the cell-cultured Flucelvax and recombinant influenza vaccine Flublok, but the rest of them are egg-based. There are several formulations that are the standard dose of inactivated influenza vaccine, and these are pretty good for age 6 months and older. With Flucelvax, this one is cell-cultured, and it is for age 6 months and older. Recombinant, because this uses recombinant DNA technology, this is only approved for age 18 years and older, so this is not FDA approved for children. And the adjuvanted and the high dose inactivated were specifically designed for elderly, so these are only approved for age 65 and older. Here are the new recommendations for elderly. So starting this year, there are 3 formulations that are preferred. So either the high dose inactivated influenza vaccine, or the recombinant influenza vaccine, or the adjuvanted influenza vaccine. And essentially with the high dose, it has been studied compared to the standard dose in elderly, and it was found to have greater vaccine efficacy in elderly. So there was a 24% greater relative efficacy. So for that reason, the high dose compared to the standard dose has better efficacy in elderly. The recombinant also shows similar results. So when compared to the standard dose inactivated, the recombinant had 30% greater relative efficacy in elderly. And the adjuvanted, which uses MF59 to boost immunogenicity, when was compared to standard dose inactivated, showed 63% greater relative efficacy. Now this seems to be pretty high, but it did have a wide confidence interval, so it could be, the benefit could be as low as 4%, but as high as 86%. But regardless, it doesn't matter which one. For the elderly, it is recommended to give one of these. Now, if none of these are available in the pharmacy, it is recommended to give anything that is available in the pharmacy that's age appropriate, as opposed to asking the patients to come back while you order one of these three, because chances are that if the patient doesn't get vaccinated, there's a good chance that they will not come back later. So while they are there, it's best to give a vaccine, even if it's not one of these three. Thank you for tuning in.